Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to another episode. I have travelled west from Cardiff in South Wales to Swansea. The weather got gradually brighter and drier and sunnier as I did so. So I will take all of the credit for bringing the nice weather down to Swansea. I have the company of Alan Twelvetrees. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, Alan.
Thanks, Russell.
It was in 2017 that we first did this in terms of recording. We'd known each other for a few years before that. And we will talk about what some of those initial discussions and collaborations led to in the form of the book that we're going to shamelessly plug. Thank you for the hospitality. We've got some delicious coffee. There's some biscuits.
Very fattening.
Yeah. Before we get into it, I just want to do a quick plug for the last couple of episodes. Episode 40 was from County Meath in the Republic of Ireland by Donald Traynor, Chief Executive of Community Finance Ireland, and from Omagh in the Northern Ireland by Conor McGale from Rose Regeneration Trust. And we were looking at social value, the concept of social value, and how CFI, Community Finance Ireland, calculates the social value its investment has in a range of social projects, community-focused projects, ranges of scale as well, some quite small, some incredibly large, across the whole island, so both sort of jurisdictions under the Republic and under the United Kingdom. And then I chatted with Paul LaChapelle from the University of Montana and Charlie McConnell, about former president of the International Association for Community Development, and that conversation was split into two episodes 41 and 42, based on their article, The 7 Deadly Sins of Community Development, that had been in the issue 3 of the Journal of the Community Development Society. And that created a few ripples, I think it's fair to say, but debate is all good.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, quick plug for those. And before we get started in the book, it was only really in the last couple of days we were going to pay a tribute to one of the contributors to the book anyway, and it's only in the last couple of days we realised another of the contributors, but more than just a contributor, in both cases, more than just a contributor, people that you know far better than me, Alan, as well, people who haven't just contributed to the book, but they've been a sounding board, they've been counsel for you.
And help promote it.
Yeah. So that's, so more recently we discovered that Judith Dunlop passed away from Ontario in Canada. She passed away, I understand, at the end of 2023. She'd done a lot around sort of social work, service user involvement, and how people, however so defined, clients, customers, service users.
Service users and service delivery, I think that was her focus. Yeah.
But had been an early adopter as well on, and how I'd come to have some interaction with it was only very, very limited in terms of the book. She had been an early adopter, or had been around people who'd been early adopters of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and so I provided a few papers and a few kind of signposts to different kind of work and projects and case studies she'd been involved in. So that was sad news. And then the other person, and we paid tribute to him in the book, Neil Jameson.
An absolute giant, Neil was. And he moved career quite late in his life, relatively, from, I think, running the Children's Society in the UK in I think, the west of England and Wales. And then he gave that all up to become, in effect, the one of the founders and leaders of Citizens UK. And then he retired and he passed on quite recently, which is very sad. Good friend as well.
And we dedicated the book, Community Development, Social Action, Social Planning, A Practical Guide. It's the 6th edition. Previous 5 editions were all your work. I've come on relatively late in the day, but we've dedicated it to the memory, the work and influence of Neil Jameson, and he will be sorely missed to the, not just Absolutely. Obviously the friends and family, but to the workforce and this sort of work in its entirety. And there's a full chapter in there by Neil around community organising. Like I said, the book's on Policy Press. There'll be a link to where to buy it in the show notes. We've got a couple of signed copies available. If people are close to us in either Swansea or Cardiff, we can maybe get copies to you if you would like them scribbled on. I've brought...
You talking about your own handwriting,
very much so. I brought my crayons down. There will also be, later in the episode, a code that we will share with you, and listeners are entitled to get a 20% discount on the book as well, online. And that discount will be available for, at least the foreseeable future, as far as I'm aware. And you can also sign up for occasional news on community development publishing, as well as receive a 25% discount on all Bristol University Press books by signing up for the subject newsletter. And there are different subject newsletters that Policy Press put out occasionally that you won't get spammed, I can assure you, whether your interest is maybe in social work, environmental work, whether it's maybe things to do with criminal justice, public service delivery, and so on. There's different subsets that they send out subject newsletters for, and you'll tend to find not only a host of books and texts, journals, and often some little freebies as well, free journal articles and free blogs and things like that. So we probably better start shamelessly plugging away. So you and I got together for the first episode of this, as I said, back in 2017, and I can remember you saying, I can't remember if that was on air, whether it made the final edit or whether it was in the conversation around, and you made a point, you're retired, but you made a point of sort of saying, where are the younger people in community development writing about their practice, their experience, their perspectives? And it was largely a rhetorical question, if I remember correctly. But I sort of took it as a little bit of a challenge. And I would argue, I mean, one of my counter arguments at the time was, well, I do this podcast, and I was at the very start of it, and that's a variation on writing. However, it did seem to me, and if we look at people like Neil, like Judith, we look at some of the other contributors to the book, Jed McHugh, I saw Jed yesterday. Jed is retired. Alex Norman is very...
Well, he's 10 years older
I was going to say, yeah.
At least, I think 12, actually.
I wasn't sure how politely I could put that. I suppose the point I'm making is...
But as sharp as a needle still.
I guess the point I'm making is that a lot of these people, they're maybe kind of front-facing, kind of very immersive community work is perhaps a little bit on the back burner. I know Alex, for example, is still involved in things in Palm Beach, but in California. But for all intents and purposes, are retired, and that is something that hopefully I've been able to bring to the book in terms of still being at the coalface, so to speak. But that is important, is that people keep talking and writing about their practice, because it shows how the role of a community worker and community development and some of the other terms that we'll pick apart, it continues to evolve.
Yeah, can I just come in there, because one of the criticisms of community work over many years is it's not cumulative. Like, when you start off, you tend to make lots of mistakes, inevitably. Well, not that many people, and this is not to blow my own trumpet, have actually written about it and said, if you come across this situation, you may well screw up in this way, so beware of this, that and the other. And if you're trained to be a surgeon, obviously you do lots of practice on dummies and things like that before you do heart surgery or something like that. But there is not really any sensible preparation for people to go into community work or related fields which require the similar skills. And I think that's a shame. It's never been recognised, as social work is, for example, or teaching. And I think that's a shame, because you do need lots of skills to do with it, and qualities.
Yeah.
Perseverance being the biggest.
Oh, for sure. This is the 6th edition, as I said. Yeah. I mean, what you've just said there, has that been a motivation behind subsequent editions, for sure, but back in that very first edition, back in, 82, 83 that it came out?
I think 82.
82. And was that the motivation, that around wanting to get stuff down on paper, which in itself can be a reflective process as well?
It's a good question. Well, I've always enjoyed writing. Well, the funny thing is, I think less so now, but I always felt slightly uneasy about communicating in public. And it's funny to admit that, after being a university lecturer for many years and having done lots of other presentations, because I'm not now, but I used to be. And used to be so many people in community work, and I used to go to conferences who came out with what I thought was sometimes border dash, but I couldn't. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being left wing, but if you're thinking that someone's going to pay you, and that's going to be government, to march on the town hall, you're 99% of the time kidding yourself. And I thought there's a lot of muddled thinking, and that's partly what prompted me to write. But also, my professor, when I did my social science qualification and then a community development qualification in Edinburgh, said, make sure you write, make sure you keep a logbook or diary about your work. I think he said that mainly because he said that's the best way of learning and tutoring yourself, which I did. And then I was originally asked to write a book in a social work series called Social Work in the Community, and in fact I think I called it that. And the publisher, and it was an earlier different publisher, they said, well, it's more about community work as such rather than social work in the community. And the first edition was called Community Work. And then subsequent editions, I realised it's both community work and it's not community work. The social planning aspects, working directly with the service providers or government or whoever, to work with them, often collaboratively, perhaps mostly collaboratively in that sense. So in fact, I introduced the concept of social planning. So community development, social action. So community development being, on the whole, working in a collaborative way with communities on self-help matters. But also the social planning bit is actually working largely with government to improve services. And the social action bit would be when you're, to simply put, marching on the town hall. But there's obviously other ways of having social action. And I think that title broadly encapsulates most of what we think of as community work. It doesn't really cover the specialist side, which might be working with older people or women or disabled people or whatever, or in a highly rural area or something like that. But that's how I came to extend the title, so to speak.
Jack Rothman was an influence on that.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Yes.
If people aren't familiar with Jack and Jack's work and his influence, yes, what would be a helpful primer then for them?
Well, it's interesting you ask that, because he wrote an absolutely seminal article called Locality Development, Social Action and Social Planning. It's quite long for an article, it's about 30 pages. And then later, and I knew Jack quite well, but he'd be well retired now, even if he's still with us. And he later admitted to me, we had some contact, he later admitted to me that in fact, if he were writing the article again, he'd call it community development, because community development is actually more than locality development. You can work with disabled people or highly, or with women or with asylum seekers, whichever kind of grouping you tend to be concerned about. So I was pleased that I think of him as a doyen in lots of ways. I'm very glad in a small way I influenced his thinking.
Yeah, no, for sure. And there are other people, sort of contemporaries then, I suppose, of him, in such as Saul Alinsky, Sherry Arnstein, ladder of participation,
yes,
who we touch on. You
yes,
use the word seminal, and
yes,
again,
right,
I think
yeah,
that word applies to them.
It's interesting, actually, Shelley Arnstein, a fantastic idea, ladder of participation, except I can't remember the detail, and I haven't communicated with her. I don't know, she might be my age, she might be older, I really don't know. But there was an issue I took with it. I think she's mostly operating in an adversarial paradigm. So I think she looks at work which is collaborative as kind of selling out.
And there's definitely, like I suppose with Jack's work and Saul himself, they're providing an apparatus, intellectually speaking, that other people then maybe build on,
That's
adapt,
right,
pull in different directions.
That's right. Or critique
For sure, and which you've just done there.
Yes,
on
that's
those
right.
elements.
Yes.
I mean, I was working with an organisation up in North Wales 3 or 4 months ago, and they were talking about co-production.
Yeah.
That's probably not a term that Sherry or Jack or Saul would have used back in the day.
No. It was probably done, but didn't have that name.
Absolutely. But what they were working on was almost the mirror image certainly intellectually and conceptually, that's the better way it would. It was Einstein's ladder of participation.
Yes,
but it had been renamed, it had evolved, there were different labels to it, but the conception
and not actually
was
drawn upon, probably.
And they didn't sort of know that. So that was kind of interesting.
And that's one of the weaknesses of community development. It's not cumulative. If somebody comes across a cure for cancer, the medical profession across the world will pick up on that very quickly. Within a year or two, they'd all be doing it. Sadly, community work is not like that.
No,
in my view.
Yeah. No, I broadly agree. So, although we're talking about some of the, the great and perhaps indeed sort of late names of the past and that kind of radical tradition in the sense of the civil rights movements in America in the 60s, in Ulster, in Ireland, you had the CND movement, you had all of these things. You had the miners' strike then in the UK in the 80s and so on. Quite febrile on some occasions.
Of course, the quote unquote the miners' wives is a terrible phrase because it's a bit sexist and oppressive. But some of the things that happen in those communities where the miners were on strike, in terms of often the women getting organised to do all kinds of self-help activities on their own without really much help from community workers, was a very good example of kind of autonomous self-help.
For sure.
But I think it died away when the strike was over and things got back to normal, whatever that actually was.
But I can think, if we were to travel sort of northeast from here up the Dillais Valley to Banwen, you've got the Dove Workshop, which still goes on today, exists today, and its entire origins is based on
that's right.
The women coming together because they wanted to learn and they wanted to educate themselves, as well as get involved in some of the mutual aid kind of activities around the miners' strike.
The coming together would have been showing solidarity as part of all that, or that being part of showing solidarity.
Yeah. So all of that has a historical context, and we embrace that. But what we're not doing with the book, or certainly what we've hoped we haven't done with the book, is to kind of regurgitate all of that. It's to use it as a basis on which to then go, okay, what is current practice like? What is some of the thinking that has influenced it? Where are there some examples? And we can maybe touch on some of those. So, for example, Judith provides one from Canada. Yeah, we've tried to put a bit of a modern kind of cushion on it, because the 5th edition would have been sort of 2015, 16, I think.
Around that, yeah.
It was certainly, so we recorded this, that first episode, 17, about 16. In the UK, we'd have had already a handful of years of austerity, public budgets being absolutely hammered. We'd have had a couple of those years under our belt by that point, has continued. You've had the pandemic, and certainly, we were still in the pandemic when we were starting this 6th edition.
Yes, very much so.
All of which, again, just kind of threw a few things up in the air and some of those received wisdoms, perhaps. And one of the things that I remember when you invited me to provide some comments on the 5th edition, and I said I felt that it didn't really speak to my practice and the practice I knew a lot of other people in Wales at the time I was working with respect to their use of digital internet technologies.
Absolutely.
And I say this in the preface.
It's not my forte.
You took
I've done it a bit. I'm moving a little bit more in that direction, and I do use the internet and so on.
But you took the criticism well. I mean, so well that you sort of said, well, okay, sunshine.
Write it.
Here we go, write it, because there's talk of another edition. My role sort of changed a little bit.
It'll be out of date in 5 minutes, of course.
Well, that's always the danger, and it was something that kind of bothered me all the way through. But of course, there was also an element of us living through change, because that pandemic, that COVID-19 pandemic, thrust a lot of us online, whether we wanted to be online or not. And you will always get early adopters of certain technologies in all disciplines, workplaces. And you'd have found those with community workers, or certainly I'd encountered those. But then you'd have also had at the other end of the spectrum some of the laggards. And I'm not saying it's better or worse. It's just people adopt these new technologies and trends and things at a different rate, at different pace, and with different levels of enthusiasm. But that pandemic thrust a lot of us online, and that was fascinating to be someone who's worked in community work for a number of years, whose keen interest and commitment to community development, wanted to talk about the role of technology in it, and then finding there was this huge development that I found incredibly stimulating.
Yes, well, given where you're coming from and your skills and interests, that would have been like hand in glove for you, I'd have thought.
And is it chapter? I think I should know this by now. I think it's chapter 6. We've got ahead of ourselves a little bit in terms of chapters. You touched on specialist community work earlier. There is elements of it in there, but again, we've got this title that very much communicates this concept of 3 models,
which comes from Jack Ross.
Community
pretty
development.
Much. It's not exactly his, but pretty
community
close.
development or locality development, social action and social planning. Yeah. But this thing around generic and specialist is also another kind of key typology that anchors the book.
I don't think anybody else talks about it. It's not in those terms, I think. Unless perhaps you'll correct me.
Well, no, and also then the kind of like the cross section is kind of like an x-axis and a y-axis as to, well, what does generic and specialist look like in the context of community development, social action, and social planning, and that's what we've tried to do. Again, what's maybe the motivation, because it's not new. This isn't brand new in this edition to have that distinction between generic and specialist. It's been in previous editions. What was your motivation behind wanting to kind of get that down on paper?
Well, I always used to write from my own experience. I mean, I don't do so much now because I don't travel so much, and in a sense I've largely said everything I pretty much wanted to say. But in fact, when I noticed people in adult education or the women's movement or in rural areas developing means of involving the community or just doing their work, some of them did it in a sense in a community work way, and some of them didn't even they may have known the word community work but didn't know what it was. But in fact they were doing it. They'd kind of developed the phrase from a French play. They maybe realised they'd been speaking community work all their life.
Yeah, but there's that sense, though, that some of these workers would recognise the things that are being written about.
Oh, I think they would, yes, that's right.
Without necessarily being aware of labels.
Yes, 1 or 2 people who have read my book or earlier versions have said, oh, that's actually what I do, but I hadn't conceptualised it like that particularly. So I think, not to blow my own trumpet too much, somebody once read the book and said, oh, I understood every word. I may have said it before. The implication being that she'd read quite a few academic type books about this field and hadn't really fully understood it, or felt the person really wasn't engaging with this woman's reality. Yeah. Like, you get it wrong half the time. I'm not particularly involved except in our local community here, but you do make mistakes.
Oh, for sure.
And you can mostly, well, I think the key is to learn from them. In fact, I think most of us probably in this field learn through getting it wrong and thought, good heavens, I don't want to go there again. I better get that sorted out. So that's how I think I learned a lot. And I had done a course on it before, but it was aimed at aiming to work in the developing world. But by, I don't know, the late 60s, those opportunities were closing down. And so I made my career in Britain, which I'm very happy to have done. I'm very lucky to have had the opportunities I've had, actually, extremely lucky.
It's not exhaustive. Our intention was not to be exhaustive, to look at every possible conceivable example of specialist community work. That is for a different book, different type of book, if being exhaustive is even feasible. But we do touch on some of the examples. Alex Norman provides a case study of work in Palm Beach in California, of working and organising the Cambodian community, immigrant community there, which, given the certain migration journey that those people had experienced, and maybe some of the discrimination they'd faced, overt or covert, and institutional, could be seen to be a degree of specialist community work. But some of those skills that Alex would have been applying, he'd have learned from a generic context, and that's kind of a good example, I think, of where we're coming from.
Well, the big thing is get to know something about the community, if that's the right word, which you're going to be working with, ideally before you start working with them. If you're working with women, a mainly women's group, for instance, some will be quote-unquote traditional women, some might be strong feminists, but you can't know that till you start meeting people, and you need to... you get it wrong some of the time, but you need to be as aware as you can before you get involved with how the people you're going to be working with are thinking, what are going to be their sore points, things like that. There's a bit, another example, but it's a bit tangential, is there was a chap in the community I worked with who wasn't really liked in the community, but he did an awful lot of work. And so in order to, and so when I worked in Broadston in Leicester, I had to involve him, but I involved him partly at some length, because I knew if I got him involved, a lot of people wouldn't join the group. On the other hand, he had a lot of expertise and knowledge, and how to weigh that up and how to handle it, and not putting him down, but bearing in mind that other people in the community would say they'd come to a meeting and he wasn't there. How do you handle that? But that's the bread and butter of working with people.
And sometimes you're literally on the spot, and you've got to make a judgment call.
Oh yeah,
and it's almost a toss of a coin sort of decision that you've got to make.
Yes.
We do get to sort of those sorts of levels, if you like, of granular experience. But again, more as a way of illustrating.
This guy used to, if people disagreed with him, he used to walk out of meetings. And after one meeting, when he did this about 3 or 4 times, and he used to resign, but he used to come back the next week because that meeting went every pretty much every week. He didn't need to, but that's another kind of issue. But this time when he walked out, it was about the 5th time. They looked at each other. All the rest of the people in the group did, and they agreed to send him a letter saying thanks. I think he gave a verbal resignation, and there were some rather rude words spoken about him after he'd left the meeting, and I think they then sent him a letter saying, well, thank you for your contribution. We're sorry you're leaving. And they didn't actually say, don't come back, and we're glad you've gone, but that's what they were meaning.
But reading between the lines, it's not always a bed of roses.
Absolutely not.
Another underpinning principle of the book is the distinction between, paid and unpaid.
Yes.
So the book is not targeted exclusively to paid community workers. There could be community leaders, for another way of putting it, working in an unpaid capacity that might once have been paid, might come to be paid in the future. But here and now might find themselves in an unpaid role. There's as much in the book for them as there is for your typical paid community worker.
Well, it's interesting you say that. You're probably right, because in fact, I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but the book is mainly aimed at paid workers, because if I would use one word to describe the essence of community development work, it's facilitation. A leader from behind. There's lots of other words. So as a facilitator, you've got to know how to run a demonstration. You've got to know how to organise a community group. You've got to know how the best way of talk to the town hall. But you've also, and in a sense primarily, and those things are not hard to learn, but to learn to be able to work with a community group to help them understand how to approach a range of issues. You're acting as an enabler in various ways. There are some people you can talk shoulder to shoulder to. You can actually say after the meeting, well, you made an absolute mess of that. And they'll take it. Other people, they'd run a mile if you said that to them. So you've got to work out when you work with people what approach to take.
I think one of the big things, again, that I have found, a challenge, a welcome challenge, is, okay, what does this look like through this increasing demand for decolonising of the workplace, of syllabuses, of museum collections or whatever.
Oh yes,
decolonise practice. And I draw on, for example, the work of someone like Michelle Dunscombe in Australia on this at the Ada Institute.
Yes.
And I suppose what we're saying in a practical sense, and that's the subtitle of the book, A Practical Guide, at the very least is for workers to engage with some of these debates, contribute to them if they feel they wish to,
and understand them,
and understand them, for sure, because it is happening, and like you say, if there isn't that tradition of cumulative sort of learning and development within community development, there's a danger then you've got pockets where maybe that decolonisation agenda is moving forward at pace, elsewhere maybe less so. But what that looks like in practice in somewhere like Australia might be different to what it looks like in Latin America,
well,
for
I was
example.
going to say Latin America is because they have their own, very much their own traditions.
And Michelle, on the podcast that the IACD, the International Association for Community Development, put out a couple of years back, she talks about going beyond merely decolonising and talks about re-indigenising.
Yes, that's right.
And I think again, these agendas, they're never static. they continue to evolve and develop in their own ways. There's a lot in there around anti-discriminatory practice, about what that means.
Written largely by somebody else.
By Alison Gilchrist. Leonie Remont, who's based in Swansea.
And she used to be a student of mine, actually. Very impressive she was.
And writes a really terrific contribution. Her partner's black, and she talks about the impact of racial fatigue and the kind of the battle fatigue, forever fighting the same fights over and over again in terms of trying to gain equality in a race, an ethnic context. But recognises that then there's also intersections around being a woman and black, being a class dimension to it as well. So we very much try to keep pace with some of those agendas.
And my friend Alex Norman in the States says stay open, because your experience, say with a black woman at one point in time, you might then expect, if you're engaging with a black woman 2 years later, that their perspective will be similar to the one of the previous lady you were working with, and it might not be the case at all.
No, and in Alan's piece he talks about being a black man working with the Cambodian community.
Oh, indeed,
and
well of course, yes,
that's
right.
Well. Yeah.
I never thought, oddly enough, because I don't think of Alex as black. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, because he's such a good friend of mine. I don't see the colour of it. I do see the colour of his skin, but he's such a good mate. So I don't actually think about him as black. And I just wonder how the Cambodian community he works with sees him, if they see him as black. There's so many blacks in America who are in a range of senior positions. Maybe it's not a factor. I don't know.
If anybody would like to fly us out to Palm Beach, we'd happily go out.
I've never asked Alex about it. I never have.
So if I was to put a sort of a hypothetical question, so a reader has got in touch, as it were, and I said, well, all this is well and good, but the planet is burning. You look at Black Lives Matters, you look at what's going on in Palestine at the moment, and all of these, the rise of populism, all of these awful things. Are you telling me that if I read this book, I can bring about that social change? What's the answer?
I don't think you can.
No.
I mean, the question behind that is, it seems to me, it's the relationship between community development work and community action and political action. And I think Alinsky said, I think after 1968 and all that, in the USA, various riots, and that's where lots of movements grew up. He said, if you really want to bring about change, go to the next Democratic convention. Presumably most community work type people would have been on the left.
Yeah.
And make sure you get elected to the Senate and you don't get elected to the Senate, or do you? No, I don't think you do. But you do get elected to the House of Representatives. You should get into government.
And that's the point I made when we launched the book back in July up at Trevalis Housing, thanks to Jenny.
Oh yeah,
O'Hara,
gosh, yes, that was great.
Yeah, and to Duncan Forbes
nice
at Trevalis
person.
Housing in Ponty. There's a South Wales colloquialism for you. Pontypridd, not Ponty. Pontypridd. We hosted that, and I made a point of the number of people that I know and that I worked with in the, say, late 2000s who are now in elected roles. Local government in the main, maybe even a tier below that we have in this country. It's sort of community, town, parish council level.
That's right.
But nevertheless in an elected capacity.
Yes, that's
and
right.
I know people that have sat in cabinet at local authority levels. So presumably these people are taking with them and importing into those elected roles some of the experience and the practice and the wisdom that they've accrued through doing community work or youth and community work or whatever it might be, generic or specialist. And so there are some of those examples, but it's interesting, that was essentially what Saul was saying back 60, almost 60 years ago. As being one of the things to do.
He wrote those two, I think he did another one as well, but the main two books he's known for are The Rules for Radicals and Rivali for Radicals. And the prologue in Rules for Radicals, I've got the book somewhere upstairs, and there's about 10 pages. And I won't say it says it all, but it gives you about 15, maybe 20 precepts about how you should conduct yourself. And while he's regarded as a radical, I think towards the end of his life, he talks about working in a collaborative way. And if he were alive today and working, I'd be very interested to see what his style would be. Obviously, he'd be about 130 or something. I don't. In fact, Alex Norman, who's 10 years, maybe 15 years older than me, was more or less a contemporary of Alinsky, but actually quite a bit younger. But he met with Alinsky several times, and he said, some of Linsky's ideas were great, but some were absolutely terrible. And he used to sit in a meeting with Linsky, and Alex used to say, "Oh, come off it, Linsky. That will never ever work." And it was quite interesting to meet someone who actually knew him, because he must have been difficult to work with, because the way, if you read his books, he criticises people left, right, and centre, and he says something like, well, I'm going to be a bit vulgar here. You're never going to run that organisation if you carry on in that shitty way, kind of stuff. Well, I suppose maybe his style worked. I couldn't do that, If my wife heard me say that, she'd divorce me, probably.
But that's a very good point, actually, which kind of preempts my next question. Is we do sort of almost pause in the book, and we kind of go, it's really important to know. I mean, I think the subheading is "Know Thyself," and to be really kind of self-aware, and to try to remain self-aware. It's not like, I'm now self-aware and that's it. We change, our circumstances in life change, maybe things that we bring to the workplace on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis, changes how we perceive things and how we respond and react to things. And we do spend a lot of time on that. So that's a really fascinating point. Because somebody gets results, in inverted commas, in this way, doesn't mean that you need to necessarily mimic or imitate that, particularly if that is taking you quite a way outside of your
own comfort zone. Yes, you have to develop your own style.
Sorry to interrupt, Alan, but that element of knowing thyself, that's been quite a prominent component in the previous editions, and it's kind of carried forward.
Well, I think so. It's interesting you say that, because I did a course in social science after my language degree. My first degree is modern languages, and I was at the end of the course. I was saying, "What do you want to go into, Mr. Twelvetrees? Was it casework, probation, or mental health?" And really didn't really fancy either of them. And I found my way. I did work as a social worker for a year, and I found myself in Liverpool, and I found myself in contact with. I did some work on some council estates as a social worker, and I found myself in contact with a few community development workers, and found that was what I was interested in. Then I got some training in that, and the rest is history, so to speak. It took me some time to do that. But in fact, how shall I put it? There was a time, not so much now, when people in community work were very much anti-everything, certainly anti the state, very critical of things like social work, regarding the problem was, quote unquote, the system, and what the hell were you doing trying to help somebody who was poor, and what they really needed was more money, so you had to change the system. I mean, that is an oversimplification, actually. And while there's obviously a case for social work, casework, I found myself more interested in the structures of mainly physical communities which were poor. And I got pleasure, intellectual satisfaction, professional satisfaction from, in a sense you might even say, being lazy, doing work with people who are leaders or potential community leaders, and then stepping back to help them or allow them to get on with the job. And in fact, in my writing, I've probably said it in that book, I know I said it in other ones, that withdrawal begins the day you start. And if you don't communicate that somehow, either directly or indirectly, you're going to create dependence. And the problem with so much human service provision, it can create dependence. Like if you take health, obviously, if you're overweight, you can go to the doctor and get pills, but it might be better to walk up the hills every other day, for instance. And I think one of the things that attracted me to community work was the idea that it's about development, it's about growth, it's about people taking themselves and largely the physical community they lived in, looking at that and then taking steps to get that improved. And that sort of ignited my fire, really. Funny that, but it did.
A lot of that resonates.
That comes across in the book, I'm sure.
It does, and a lot of that resonates with me. So the book is split into three parts. Part one we've really been exploring to date in the conversation, and is titled Understanding Community Work and Yourself. Part two then covers the processes of sort of setting up and working with community groups, and is a little bit more kind of technical, a little bit more
partly.
kind of practical, the doing of. There's elements of that in part one as well. We look at aspects of the law, we look at financial management, contracts, commissioning, working with the police. There's my chapter on digital information technologies.
I'm very grateful for it. I couldn't have done it. It would have taken me another 2 years to actually just research to get it right.
Like I said, I'm still worried that it's already out of date.
Probably is.
But anyway, when we look at things like evaluation, there's Neil's chapter around broad-based organising. That's probably the part of the book that is probably most different to previous editions.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. And there's lots of contributors from outside on some of that, isn't there?
Well, I don't know if I told you this, but when I was working in Los Angeles at the university there, just doing research, I'd always been rather critical of Alinsky, but I stumbled across the Industrial Areas Foundation and went on one of the courses that they ran and saw some people in New York as well who were involved with that. And I don't know what Alinsky himself would have thought, because he'd been dead many years now. But I thought that they had moved forward in the sense that to parody Alinsky, and to be fair to him, he does move a bit more towards the centre, towards the end of his life and at the end of his books. But his approach could be labelled as fighting the people in power. It's actually much more sophisticated than that. But I helped set up the Citizens UK, as you know. I'm no longer involved with it. And in fact, to summarise their approach, it will be you build community action, so you build power. So the people in power, which can be the private sector or it can be government, obviously, realise that they've got to deal with you, because you can create problems for them if you don't. But once you get in a relationship with them, the relationship is a bit like as if they were prepared to meet you to start with. So you actually have to work collaboratively and concede and bargain and things like that. So in fact, if you'd read Alinsky and read the end of his writings, he actually does talk about when you've actually built your power, then you've got to keep that power because the other side, as it were, knows you've got it, and you can hurt them if they don't go along with you. But then you could behave a bit more like equals, and you can then get into more of a collaborative relationship.
And that's then where some of the social planning side of things and that element of the overall sort of book title is explored a little bit more in part 3 and some of the practical aspects of that, again, that subtitle, A Practical Guide, because one might find themselves as a manager for a local authority or a large public body.
Community workers have difficulty with that.
And
often.
And there's a couple of case studies, I think one's anonymous.
Yes, that's right.
That bears that out.
That's right.
Both of us have found ourselves in management roles, and there's a lot there around things like budgeting, like I said, the commissioning of services. That word partnership, that certainly in the UK feels like almost kind of like one of those quintessential sort of new Labour third way words. I worked on partnerships that had a capital P as well as small P's.
Well, often there's a capital P but no small P.
No, and the role around kind of developing those, facilitating them, nurturing them is all touched on. Service user participation, so we bring in some of that co-production element of things as well. Part 4 then is we drill down a little bit more into, a lot more, into specialist community work and then what we call advanced practice. And one of the examples that we use for advanced practice is we head over to Northern Ireland and Viola Kilmurray provides us some fascinating examples of essentially kind of how community work that has an element of social planning because of the governance arrangements at play there. But community work is essentially, rebuilding communities, maintaining peace in post-conflict Northern Ireland. And I found that fascinating.
Yes.
It was it's a huge privilege to have my title on a book, my name on the cover of a book, yet someone has provided a contribution that is so far out of my comfort zone in terms of, what I know about it. Experience for sure. I think that's an absolute incredible part of the book and take my hat off to Viola for that. We also touch on community development and health in Northern Ireland as well. And so there's quite a strong Northern Irish flavour to section, to part 4 of the book. There's also some things around kind of economic development, which is a specialism of yours. as well, in which you've written
I would say
previously.
was probably.
Was.
It is. I did a little research on it. I've never done it actually. Well, only very indirectly. But when I spent my year in at University of California, Los Angeles, that's what I did my research in, looking at the UK and the USA, and I did write a book about that.
We look at things like social enterprises. We don't go into detail about different types, different kind of structures. We touch on that. We look at some of the current trends and concepts, and I think what we've tried to do is to bring those background to community work. And if you're a community worker working on an estate somewhere that may be on the edge of town, or might be quite a rural location, you might not see many colleagues from day to day.
Oh, indeed. No.
Most of your contact with people, in a local kind of community resident.
But there will
capacity.
probably be other workers there, play workers. There might be
sure.
one or two social workers who are interested in the community, one or two teachers, maybe an adult education worker. We had a lunch club, mainly for professionals actually, and we met, I think, every Friday, and we shared a lot of information that way, because ensuring that the various professionals work in an area, physical geographical area, liaise together is really important.
Oh, absolutely.
Because often they do their work in isolation.
But what we've tried to do is look at some of those current trends, so that actually economic development, quite a broad term.
Yeah.
What does it mean? How does it apply? And we've looked at things like inclusive growth. We've looked at this rise of the so-called precariat.
Oh, right, precariat, what a phrase.
The foundational economy, circular economy, community wealth building. These are concepts that actually, if they are to resonate, I would argue, and we do argue in the book, if these were to resonate and kind of take root, if you like, in communities, then it's community workers working with communities who have really potentially really important role for helping that anchoring take place.
Though community economic is actually very difficult. Community economic development is very difficult. It's probably about the most problematic, I'd say.
But doing it under maybe an old paradigm of traditional kind of job creation, which we've had experience of in South Wales, for example, is different, I would argue, to doing it in a community wealth building concept. So the practical aspect of this, at the very least, is that someone reading this goes, okay, we've got a couple of paragraphs on it. I understand it. There's some references to look at. Go off and essentially do the reading. Speak to the people. Listen to episodes of the podcast, this podcast, others, about some of these concepts, and just kind of put those building blocks in place. Because who knows what's going to be the next buzz strategy from the government in your jurisdiction in 2, 5, 10 years' time.
Yeah. Can I say something about economic development? It's probably one of the most difficult areas. People who are new to it think of enabling an individual to set up a small business, and that's highly problematic. There are other ways of doing it, like, problematic though it may be, trying to get investment from an existing business to set up a firm or whatever in that area. That would be one of the bigger ones. Or to use grants to get a building relatively cheaply in which you can house individual entrepreneurs to set up their own businesses, to actually get community groups who have probably no experience of running a business to start from nothing. Almost always fails. And in fact, if you look at people who set up their own businesses, often they've tried 3 or 4 times and failed completely. And they're doing it for themselves, so every penny they make goes to them. So the commitment among them to succeed is high, and yet most fail to start with anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's why the episode with Donal and Connor in Ireland about community finance in Ireland, I think, is so instructive, because there is a slightly different model. The bottom line is still the bottom line. Yeah, a loss can only be sustained, or losses can only be sustained for so long. So it's not kind of completely recreating or reinventing some brand new paradigm, but working within that paradigm. There are some different models there. So I'd encourage people to listen there. I think, frankly, as well. I mean, let's refer to the elephant in the room. In my experience, and perhaps in yours as well, European money in the UK went into a lot of these sorts of enterprise-related activities at whatever scale. And some of those are closed off now thanks to Brexit, and it still remains to be seen what's going to happen with this levelling up agenda. What with the UK government, a little bit sceptical about all of that. personally. So there's like I said, anyway, there's a lot in there. Let's keep our powder dry. Otherwise, there's no reason to read the book, is there? If we say too much.
Well,
about
people
it.
have to have jolly good memories. I suppose they can play this podcast several times. Whether they would or not is another question.
I'm sure they would. And we wrap it up with a glimpse to the future. And this was something that Policy Press were particularly keen on as well, amongst other things. And for me, this is something that I was quite determined to get in the book, because I think that the pandemic gave us a glimpse behind what I call a post, and what others call a post-work future. And so we've tried to locate community work within different futures where things like, universal basic income might exist, where there might be greater understanding of sort of trauma-informed practice, something that we've heard a lot about in social work, health work, teaching. I haven't heard a huge amount of it in the community work sector, but I do wonder whether that's where the next sector, so to speak, to kind of really get our head around it. So we've tried to look at the future. So we spend a lot of time looking at the past and where community work and community development has come from, like some of the names we've mentioned. Paulo Freire, we haven't mentioned him yet. He's in the book a lot, of course.
Yes, that's right,
So we've done a lot of that, but we tried to look to the future as well. And there's some stuff there that I'm really interested in hearing people push back against, maybe, or to provide some feedback on. And again, if nothing else, if someone listening to this is a community worker in some capacity or other, generic or specialist, paid or unpaid, in the UK or elsewhere, is to then sort of think, okay, what does this mean? And to just go and do some reading. And to kind of think, okay, what does that mean for me? Where do I see my practice, or where might I see my practice? And I think that's the least we encourage people to do.
I suppose looking back over 40 years, I suppose, of being involved in the field, possibly more. I think very often people who are politicians or maybe senior officers come across the idea of community involvement, whatever's actually meant by that, and develop policies or maybe put funding into programs which are meant to empower communities. Often those are funded, and the CDPs will be an example in Britain going back to the 60s. They're funded often out of goodwill, without possibly people who know much about community development being deeply involved with that. And then when there's a march on the town hall, or the community wants to do, the local authority wants them to work on X, say a piece of wasteland, but the community wants to do something else, then the people in local government can't really handle that, because it's not like delivering a service where you put the resources in, 50 childcare places, you put in 100 grand or whatever it is, and there you've got you train the people, you put them in post. I mean, communities bite back, rightly or wrongly, sometimes wrongly, sometimes quite rightly. And in fact, I found there are very few people in local government who really got, and sometimes in central government, who haven't really got a sense of what it's like to walk the streets and talk to community people and find out what they want, and realise that you've actually got to work with them. And sometimes something's a red herring, or the people in the community want to do X and you think they should be doing Y, and how to handle all that with marrying up the ability to convey the knowledge you have, which might be useful to them, but not being patronising. And it's quite difficult to get that right, because if you have lots of knowledge which is relevant, find a way of sharing. But if in fact you're saying, well, if you want to do this, you've got to do it that way, is just the way not to involve people.
Listener, if what Alan's just said, if that speaks to you, then this is the book for you. So I promised a discount code to listeners for a 20% discount. That's available via the Policy Press website. So if you go to policy.bristoluniversitypress.co.uk, there's a whole load of sort of subsections related to different themes. If you find the community development one, you will find a link to the book. It will also be in the show notes. And at checkout, if you use the code CDS20, that's Charlie Delta Sierra 20, then you will get the discount. And I think that discount will be valid for as long as it needs to remain valid. Sign up there as well for the subject newsletters, where there's other kind of offers and discounts available, as well as I said, sort of freebie articles and things. Talking Policy Press, probably should say thank you to the likes of Angela, to Leanne, who've been helping us, get this book over the line, to get it published, to
Very
get it
helpful
on
indeed.
people's
Very
desks.
helpful. Great working with them.
And certainly to Sarah Bird, the commissioning editor. I think she's moved on to a different bit of Policy Press now. But thank you to Sarah for all of her guidance and disciplining of us as well. Indeed. Along the way, keeping us on track. Like I said, we dedicate,
making sure we put the commas and the semicolons in the right places.
I do like a semicolon. I'll be honest. And you like italics, so
I like italics.
We all have our little foibles.
Yes, indeed.
Is there anybody else that we should say thank you to?
I thank my fantastic wife for bearing with me while I shut myself away for quite a bit of time sometimes. Now I'm retired, I can do it in the day, but it used to be in the evenings, and so she's been very forbearing and also very encouraging. If I decide to do it again with you, obviously, or maybe you decide to do it again and you put me in, then I've got a good excuse to spend the time on my computer. It's over to you now, then, Russell, if you want to.
There's background noise as I shift uneasily in the chair. Still sort of basking in the glory, so to speak, of getting this. This is my first ever endeavour of anything of this nature. There's been some interesting conversations about maybe revisiting that digital chapter and maybe fleshing that out a little bit
there, if you want it.
So there's some potential conversations to be had there. But for the time being, I'm just enjoying the summer holidays and still hoping that people are going to find this book and it's going to have a meaningful impact on them, really. And I'd like to thank you as well, Alan, because it was a book I'd been familiar with for a number of years. Before I'd got to know you, we were trustees of an organisation, and I found it a really, like I said, a welcome challenge, both in terms of that writing craft and honing that kind of muscle, but also then on an intellectual level and that kind of
it's a compulsion. My end in a way has been less so now, but it was a compulsion.
And that kind of pushback. Yeah, but what do you mean? What are you trying to say? And that I found quite helpful. Not always enjoyable, I'll be honest. Because like I said, it can be that kind of compulsive.
Well, you fail half the time. I'm not sure if you're talking about reading it or doing it, but I mean, I can think of when I think some people have said. You talk about your mistakes, not many people do, but you're going to fail a quarter of the time if you're doing quite well. And to start with, you fail much more than that. Yeah. that'll be on my tombstone. Failed most of the time, but got some things right. Well, they say the English. I think the English. So I mean, I'm half Welsh. I think I'm born in England, but I've lived in Wales so long. They say the English lose every war but the last one. I don't know quite how that's read on anyway I've said it.
So, yes, if you email me at the podcast, thecommunitydevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com, we can maybe get a signed copy if that would be your preference. As I said, I brought my crayons down with me. Should we leave it there, Alan? Let's keep some of the powder dry, otherwise there's no reason to buy the book, let alone read it. if we give any more away. So please head over to the website. Like I said, there's signed copies available. I'm really looking forward to later this week, I don't know when the episode will be out, chatting to the Stove Network up in Dumfries in Scotland, the south of Scotland, where they use creative placemaking as their kind of conceptual kind of framework and apparatus for what they call community development and placemaking. So I'm likewise. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that. And then I will be heading back to Scotland, I think, for the next episode after that, to the Fallin community near Stirling, and listening to how they are tackling the climate crisis through kind of like grassroots, community-based, environmental work that goes a little bit beyond, the community garden, the sort of traditional inverted commas, maybe environmental community work practice that maybe you and I are probably more familiar with, and really kind of cranking it up because the planet needs it to be cranked up and getting involved at a bit more of a higher scale. So I'm really fascinated. I've had a couple of conversations with Naomi there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about all of that.
All power to your Albert.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at comdevt podcast, COMMDEVT podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.